Dark forest. A single flashlight beam cuts through the trees. Low wind. A distant sound that isn't quite an animal. Somewhere in the American Southwest, there is a road locals have learned not to look at after dark. There is a silence that settles over certain places, and it has a name. Welcome to local legends. Today, the Skinwalkers, not from the hand that holds it, but from what the light refuses to touch. There are spaces between the trees where the darkness seems thicker, more deliberate. The wind carries no scent of sage or juniper, only something older, something that has learned to move without disturbing the air. Your boots find purchase on red earth that has drunk 10,000 years of rain. And you understand, in a way that bypasses language entirely, that you are being observed by something that knows this landscape better than you know your own reflection. The road stretches north through reservation land, unnamed on most maps, marked only by the absence of tire tracks after sunset. Locals don't speak its name to outsiders. They don't forbid travel along its length. They simply look away when you mention it, the way you might look away from a funeral procession, and the conversation moves elsewhere. That silence, the one that lives in the gap between what is said and what is known, has texture weight. It presses against your sternum like a hand, and somewhere in that silence, threading through the python and the scrub, moving on legs that might be human or might be something else entirely, walks a thing that has many names but answers to none of them. The Navajo call it Nailed Lushi, the one who walks on all fours. But most people, when they speak of it at all, use the English translation that has seeped into the American consciousness, like water into sandstone. Skinwalker, the Din Fei. The people who call themselves simply, the people have inhabited the high desert plateaus of what is now the Four Corners region for centuries. This is not land that forgives carelessness. The northern Arizona and New Mexico territories, where the Navajo Nation now holds sovereignty, encompass 27,000 square miles of terrain that oscillates between impossible beauty and killing indifference. Summer temperatures in the lower elevations can reach 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Winter nights in the highlands plunge below zero. Water is scarce. The distances between settlements are measured not in convenience, but in survival. In such a landscape, spirituality is not abstract philosophy, but practical cosmology, a map for navigating forces that can sustain you or erase you with equal dispassion. The Din Fei worldview recognizes H-Vei, harmony, balance, beauty, as the proper state of existence. But harmony requires boundaries. It requires knowing what belongs in the human world and what must remain outside it. The universe, in Navajo belief, is populated by beings of immense power, the holy people who shaped creation, the spirits that animate every rock and canyon and living thing, and other entities whose purposes are not aligned with human flourishing. Power in this tradition is not inherently good or evil. It simply is. A lightning storm brings life, giving rain, and can also split a man in half. A canyon offers shelter and can trap you in a flash flood. The question is never whether power exists, but how it is used, and by whom. Every member of the community has a role in maintaining balance. Singers and medicine people learn the chants and ceremonies that restore harmony when it is broken. Families teach children the stories that contain crucial survival information coded in narrative form. And everyone, from the eldest to the youngest, learns what must never be done. Among those prohibitions, those boundaries that hold chaos at bay, is the practice of dark magic. The Navajo have a word for it, Fente, witchcraft way. It represents the deliberate inversion of sacred knowledge, where a medicine person uses ritual to heal. The practitioner of Fente uses ritual to harm, where balance is meant to serve the community. Witchcraft serves only the self, and the most feared practitioners of this inverted power, the ones who have crossed a line from which there is no return, are the Nailed Lushi. They are witches in the old hard sense of the word. Individuals who have chosen to gain power through transgression, who have murdered someone they love to break their own humanity, who wear the skins of animals to move through the world as predators move through it, not as shamans seeking wisdom or communion with the animal world, but as hunters who have learned to wear death itself. The Skinwalker defies easy categorization. It is not a cryptid in the sense of Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster, creatures whose existence remains unverified, but whose nature, if proven, would simply expand the catalogue of zoology. The Skinwalker is emphatically human in origin. It was born, raised, taught the language and stories and songs of the Din Fei. It ate at the family table. It learned which plants could heal and which could kill. And then, through acts whose specifics are discussed only in whispers, it chose to become something else. Descriptions of skinwalkers vary, but certain elements recur with unsettling consistency across accounts, separated by decades and hundreds of miles. Most often, witnesses describe a figure moving on all fours, not crawling, but running with a fluid, predatory gait that seems wrong for human anatomy. The limbs are too long. The joints bend at angles that suggest a fundamental rearrangement of skeletal structure. The skin, when visible, is often described as leathery or stretched, mottled in ways that suggest it doesn't quite fit the frame beneath it. Some versions emphasize the eyes, glowing yellow or red in the darkness, reflecting light like a nocturnal animal's but containing an intelligence that is distinctly, horrifyingly human. Others focus on the sound, footsteps that are too heavy for the size of the creature, or too light, or perfectly silent despite the speed of movement. Still others remember the voice, the way it mimics human speech imperfectly, like someone who has learned language from recordings without understanding its rhythms. A child's voice calling from the darkness, but the inflection is wrong. A relative's voice asking to be let inside, but the words are slightly out of sync with what a living person would say. The ethnographer Clyde Cluckhone, who conducted extensive fieldwork among the Navajo in the 1940s, recorded testimony describing skinwalkers as individuals who possess the ability to transform into coyotes, wolves, foxes, owls, or crows, animals already associated with death or trickery in Navajo cosmology. The transformation, according to these accounts, is not metaphorical. The skinwalker literally dons the pelt of the animal, secured through rituals that bind the witch's consciousness to the skin. Once transformed, the skinwalker gains the animal's speed, senses, and stealth, but retains human cunning and malice. Other descriptions suggest something less complete, a hybrid state where the transformation is imperfect, leaving the skinwalker trapped between forms. Witnesses describe creatures with human hands, but canine heads, or bodies covered in fur, but walking upright on legs that bend like human legs. This partial transformation might represent a failure of the ritual, or it might be intentional, a choice to retain certain human capabilities while gaining animal advantages. The ambiguity is itself threatening. You cannot prepare for what you cannot define. The abilities attributed to skinwalkers extend beyond shapeshifting. They are said to possess superhuman speed, capable of keeping pace with vehicles traveling at 70 or 80 miles per hour across open desert terrain. They can leap onto rooftops in a single bound. They can mimic any voice they have heard, calling out in the dark with the voice of someone you trust, luring you away from safety. Some accounts describe skinwalkers running alongside cars on remote highways, matching speed effortlessly, their faces pressed against the window, grinning with something that might be rage or might be joy at the terror they inspire. They are said to read minds, to know your name before you speak it, to understand your fears as if they were their own. They can curse you with illness, madness, or death through mere proximity. The Navajo tradition holds that making eye contact with a skinwalker is especially dangerous. It creates a connection, a psychic doorway through which the witch can enter your life. After such an encounter, misfortune follows. Livestock die without explanation. Family members fall ill. Accidents happen with increasing frequency, and at night, you hear things moving outside your home, circling, testing the boundaries of your protection. As for weaknesses, the lore is frustratingly vague, perhaps deliberately so. Traditional Navajo belief holds that saying the name of a skinwalker draws its attention, that speaking of these things in detail invites them into your life. But fragments of protection rituals have been documented. Ash from certain ceremonial fires, worn in a pouch, is said to offer defense. White ash specifically, applied to doors and windows, creates barriers that skinwalkers cannot cross. Corpse powder, a substance made from the ground bones of the dead, is both a tool of skinwalkers and, paradoxically, a means of identifying them. And some accounts suggest that revealing a skinwalker's human identity, speaking their true name aloud, strips them of their power. But these protections come with a cost to use them. You must first acknowledge what you are protecting yourself against. You must speak the thing into existence, at least within your own mind. And in doing so, you risk everything. The creation of a skinwalker is not an accident. It is not a curse inflicted by others or a disease that spreads through contact. It is a choice. The worst choice a human being can make within the Navajo moral universe. The specifics of the transformation ritual are not spoken of in detail, even among medicine people, but the broad outlines have been documented by anthropologists working with Navajo consultants, willing to discuss such matters in clinical terms. The would-be skinwalker must commit a profound act of evil, one that severs their connection to Hfei, to harmony and balance, completely and irrevocably. The logic is grimly practical. By killing someone you love, someone whose death wounds you as deeply as it wounds the community, you demonstrate absolute commitment to the path of faint Fani. You prove that you have rejected human bonds, that you are willing to become something other than human. Following this murder, the initiate must participate in further rituals that invert sacred Navajo ceremonies, where a healing ceremony brings someone back into harmony with the universe. These rituals are designed to push the practitioner outside the boundaries of human society entirely. Songs are sung backward. Sacred pollen is desecrated. Taboos are deliberately violated. Acts too specific and too disturbing to be detailed here, but all designed to break the rules that separate the sacred from the profane. The final step involves the acquisition of animal skins. These are not pelts taken from animals hunted in the traditional way, with prayers and respect. They are skins from animals killed specifically for this purpose, often in ways that maximize suffering. The pelt is then prepared through rituals that bind it to the witch's body and spirit. When the skinwalker dons the skin, the transformation occurs, a merging of human consciousness with animal form, powered by the accumulated violation of every boundary that makes human community possible. What drives someone to make this choice? Anthropological accounts suggest several motivations, all rooted in the most corrosive human impulses. Some seek power over others, the ability to harm enemies, to accumulate wealth through supernatural means, to operate beyond the constraints of law and custom. Others are driven by vengeance, willing to sacrifice their humanity to strike at those who have wronged them. Still, others are described as having fallen prey to jealousy, greed, or simple malice, emotions that, in the Navajo worldview, represent disharmony given human form. But perhaps the most disturbing element of the Skinwalker tradition is the implication that these witches were, at some point, ordinary people. They were raised in the same communities they now terrorize. They learned the same stories. The Skinwalker represents not an external threat, not a monster that comes from somewhere else, but a betrayal from within. The monster was your neighbor, your relative, someone who sat beside you at the fire. The transformation is portrayed as irreversible. Once you have crossed that line, there is no ceremony that can restore you, no ritual that can bring you back into harmony. The Skinwalker is in the most literal sense damned, not by the judgment of a distant deity, but by their own actions. They have made themselves into something that cannot coexist with the human community. They are, by definition, outside the circle of the people, and the only relationship possible between the community and the Skinwalker is one of mutual recognition. We know what you are, and you know that we know. The tragedy lies not in the destruction the Skinwalker causes, though that is real enough, but in the waste of the knowledge required to become a Skinwalker is the same knowledge used by medicine people to heal. Someone who understands the ceremonies well enough to invert them is someone who could have used that understanding to restore HV. The Skinwalker, in other words, represents the dark mirror of the healer. The same power, the same knowledge, turned toward opposite ends. Every Skinwalker is a healer who could have been a teacher who chose not to teach, a guardian who decided to become a threat. When European colonizers and missionaries first encountered Navajo beliefs about witchcraft and skinwalkers, they interpreted these accounts through the lens of their own supernatural traditions. The results were predictable: misunderstanding, layered upon misunderstanding, each distortion making it harder to perceive the actual contours of Navajo belief. Spanish missionaries in the 17th and 18th centuries, working to convert indigenous populations of the Southwest, documented what they understood as devil worship and satanic pacts among various native groups. Father Eusebio Kino, working among the O'odham and other groups south of what would become the Navajo Nation, wrote in 1690, one of sorcerers who take the shapes of beasts to do the devil's work. These accounts conflated dozens of distinct tribal traditions into a single category of pagan evil, interpreted through the Catholic framework of demonic possession and witchcraft that was, at that time, still burning people alive in Europe. The Franciscan missionaries who established missions in New Mexico in the 18th century showed similar patterns of interpretation. A 1668 report by Fray Juan Bernal describes witches among the savage peoples who transform into wolves and coyotes to attack Christian Indians. The report recommends increased evangelization and the suppression of native superstitions through force if necessary. What the missionaries failed to grasp, or chose not to grasp, was that Navajo beliefs about skinwalkers were not superstition, but a sophisticated system of social control, a way of defining and punishing those who violated community norms. By the late 19th century, as anthropology emerged as a discipline and scholars began conducting systematic fieldwork among Native American groups, the interpretations shifted, but remained fundamentally external. Washington Matthews, one of the first ethnographers to study Navajo culture extensively, published Navajo Legends in 1897. His description of skinwalkers emphasizes their role in explaining misfortune. When a Navajo falls ill, or his crops fail, or his animals die, he may attribute these troubles to the malign influence of a witch who has transformed into a beast. Matthew's framing reduces the skinwalker to a psychological coping mechanism, a way for a primitive people to explain random events through supernatural agency. This interpretation, the skinwalker as folk explanation for otherwise inexplicable misfortune, became the dominant scholarly view for much of the 20th century. It aligned with the prevailing anthropological theories of the time, which understood indigenous beliefs as pre-scientific attempts to explain natural phenomena. The skinwalker, in this reading, filled the same role as evil spirits or angry gods in other cultures, a narrative tool for making sense of a dangerous world. What these scholarly accounts consistently missed was the degree to which skinwalker beliefs functioned as genuine warnings about genuine dangers. Not dangers from shape-shifting witches necessarily, but dangers from individuals who had broken social bonds, who operated outside community norms, who used their knowledge to harm rather than help. In a culture where survival depended on cooperation, where the harsh environment made social cohesion a matter of life and death, the Skinwalker represented the ultimate antisocial act. It was not a metaphor. It was a description of a real social phenomenon. The person who chooses self-interest over community welfare, given supernatural expression. The outsider interpretations had practical consequences. As federal policies forced indigenous peoples onto reservations and attempted to suppress native religious practices, knowledge about traditional beliefs became dangerous to possess. The U.S. government's ban on Native American religious ceremonies, in effect from 1883 until 1934, meant that speaking openly about any aspect of traditional spiritual life could result in imprisonment or the removal of children to boarding schools. Knowledge went underground. Stories were told only within families, only in Navajo language, only to those who could be trusted not to repeat them to Indian agents or missionaries. This suppression had the unintended effect of preserving some aspects of Skinwalker lore, while allowing others to mutate in isolation. As younger generations lost fluency in Navajo language and traditional ways, the stories survived, but their context, the entire cosmological framework that gave them meaning, became fragmented. By the mid-20th century, many Navajo people knew that skinwalkers were real and dangerous, but the specific details of what they were, how they operated, and how to protect against them had become confused. The anthropologist Clyde Cluckone's work in the 1940s represents one of the more careful attempts to document Navajo witchcraft beliefs, without imposing external frameworks. In Navajo Witchcraft, published in 1944, Cluckone notes that his informants spoke with absolute conviction about the reality of witchcraft, but with great reluctance about its specifics. He documents the social dynamics around accusations of witchcraft, the ways communities dealt with suspected skinwalkers, and the genuine fear these beliefs generated. But even Cluckone, working within the structural functionalist paradigm of his era, frames skinwalker beliefs primarily as mechanisms for managing social tension within the community. The gulf between how the Navajo understood skinwalkers and how outsiders interpreted them remained vast. For anthropologists and missionaries, skinwalkers were beliefs, folkloric elements, cultural artifacts to be studied or suppressed. For the Navajo, skinwalkers were, and are, something that exists in the world, something to be wary of, something whose reality is not up for academic debate. That divide persists. When non-native people discuss skinwalkers today, they often do so in the language of cryptozoology or urban legend. When Navajo people discuss them, if they discuss them at all with outsiders, the conversation is weighted with the knowledge that some things are not meant to be explained, only avoided. The first documented case that brought skinwalker beliefs to wider American attention occurred, not through folklore collections or anthropological studies, but through the criminal justice system. In 1974, a Navajo man named George Abney was found dead near his home on the reservation in northwest New Mexico. The circumstances were unusual enough that they attracted attention beyond the immediate community. Abney had been a respected member of his community, known for his traditional knowledge and his role in local ceremonies. His death was violent, but the specifics were unclear. According to the investigation conducted by the Navajo police and documented in tribal court records, several witnesses reported seeing a large animal, described variously as a wolf or a coyote larger than any natural specimen, near Abney's home in the days before his death. One witness, whose name was withheld in the official report, stated that the animal had watched them with human eyes, and that when they tried to chase it away, it had stood on its hind legs and run into the darkness on 2 feet. Another witness reported hearing Abney arguing with someone outside his home the night he died. But when they looked out to see who was there, they saw only that same large canine figure circling the property. The official cause of death was listed as animal attack of unknown origin. But within the community, a different explanation circulated. Abney had been killed by a skinwalker, specifically by someone he had accused of practicing feint feini several months earlier. The accusation had caused serious social disruption. The accused individual had been ostracized by some community members, supported by others. Tensions had been escalating. And then, Abney died, and the accused individual left the reservation abruptly, not to return. The case was never prosecuted. Tribal authorities declined to pursue charges, citing insufficient evidence. But the incident established a pattern that would repeat itself in subsequent decades. An unexplained death or injury on reservation land. Witnesses reporting animal-like figures behaving in disturbing ways. Community members speaking quietly about skinwalkers, while refusing to provide details to outside investigators. In June of 1987, a family driving on a remote highway near Kayenta, Arizona, reported an encounter that would later be documented by both tribal police and independent researchers. The family, a couple, and their 2 teenage children, all Navajo, were returning home around midnight when they noticed what appeared to be a large dog running alongside their vehicle. The father, who was driving, accelerated. The creature kept pace at speeds approaching 75 miles per hour. The thing was still there, running parallel to the car, close enough that they could see it clearly in the moonlight. What they saw, according to their statement to police, was not a dog. It was man-shaped, but ran on all fours with an animal's speed and grace. Its skin looked wrong, pale and hairless in some places, covered with patchy fur in others. When it turned its head to look at them, the father saw a face that was neither human nor canine, but something between the two. The teenage daughter, who was in the back seat, reported that the creature smiled at her, a distinctly human expression on a distinctly inhuman face. The father accelerated to 90 miles per hour. The creature fell back slightly, then leaped onto the roof of the car. The family heard and felt its weight moving above them, claws or fingers. The mother couldn't say which, scraped against the roof and sides of the vehicle. Creature's face appeared in the rear window, upside down still. When the family pulled over several miles later to check for damage, they found deep scratches on the roof and sides of the car, but no other evidence of what had occurred. The Navajo police took the report seriously. Officer James Chi, who documented the incident, noted in his report that the family was credible and deeply shaken, and that the physical damage to the vehicle was consistent with their account. He also noted that this was the third similar report from that stretch of highway in 2 years. The report was filed and, like most such reports, went nowhere. What can law enforcement do when the suspect is something that shouldn't exist? A 1996 case from the Navajo reservation drew attention because it involved multiple independent witnesses and occurred during daylight hours. A group of construction workers, a mix of Navajo and non-native employees, were working on a road improvement project in a remote area when they saw what they initially took to be a coyote standing on a ridge overlooking their work site. One of the workers, a non-native man named Robert Martinez, threw a rock at the animal to scare it off. Animal dropped to all fours and ran, not away, but toward them as it approached. And when it was perhaps 50 feet away, it stood upright again, fully upright, on 2 legs, and continued walking toward them in a strange, jerking stride that one witness described as like a puppet on strings. The face was coyote-like but flattened, the eyes too large and set too far apart. It wore, several witnesses agreed, what looked like ragged clothing or possibly a pelt that didn't quite cover its entire body. The crew foreman, A Navajo man shouted something in Navajo. Witnesses who didn't speak the language couldn't say what, and the workers ran to their vehicle. The creature watched them go, according to Martinez, who looked back as they were driving away. It stood motionless on the ridge, backlit by the desert sun, and even from that distance Martinez could see that it was still watching them. The construction company shut down the job site for a week. When work resumed, the crew was different, and the Navajo workers who returned refused to discuss what had happened. These documented cases share common elements: encounters on reservation land or in areas with significant Navajo populations, creatures that blur the line between human and animal, witnesses who are credible and traumatized, and a consistent refusal by those who know the most to provide details to outsiders. The reports continue. A 2004 incident near Shiprock, New Mexico, involved a family whose home was repeatedly approached by something that scratched at the walls and called out in the voices of dead relatives. A 2009 case from the Ute Reservation in Colorado described a hunter who found himself being stalked by something that mimicked his own movements, staying just out of sight, but making sure he knew it was there. Perhaps the most extensively documented recent case is the so-called Skinwalker Ranch incidents in Utah, though this case comes with significant caveats. The ranch, also known as Sherman Ranch, achieved notoriety in the 1990s, when the family living there reported a sustained series of bizarre phenomena: cattle mutilations, sightings of strange creatures, UFO activity, and other high strangeness. The family sold the property to Robert Bigelow, a wealthy businessman with interests in paranormal research, who established the National Institute for Discovery Science to investigate the site. The NIDS team documented multiple incidents over several years, though their findings have been criticized by skeptics as poorly controlled and overly credulous. Nonetheless, their reports describe encounters with large canine creatures that seemed to exhibit intelligent behavior, animals that appeared and disappeared without leaving tracks, and a general sense of being watched by something unseen. Significantly, the ranch is located near the Ute Reservation, and Ute tribal law includes traditions similar to Navajo Skinwalker beliefs. The Skinwalker Ranch cases sparked enormous media attention and helped bring Skinwalker lore into mainstream American consciousness. But they also complicated the narrative. The ranch became associated with UFOs, government conspiracies, interdimensional portals, and a host of other paranormal phenomena that have little connection to traditional Navajo beliefs. Many Navajo people regard the Skinwalker Ranch phenomenon as a distortion, a commercialization and misrepresentation of something that should not be commodified or sensationalized. What the documented cases establish, setting aside questions of interpretation, is that people continue to report encounters with entities that match traditional descriptions of skinwalkers. These reports come from witnesses with no apparent motive to fabricate, often from people who are reluctant to speak publicly about their experiences. The reports follow patterns consistent across decades and geographic areas, and they occur in contexts where belief in skinwalkers is not an abstract folkloric interest, but a lived reality. The skinwalker entered popular culture through a gradual process of dilution and transformation that began in the late 20th century and accelerated with the rise of internet creepypasta and contemporary horror media. The trajectory of this evolution reveals how indigenous beliefs can be simultaneously celebrated and stripped of their cultural context, turned into entertainment for audiences who have no connection to the traditions that created them. The earliest mainstream appearance of Skinwalker, like entities in American popular culture, predates the term itself. Algernon Blackwood's 1908 story, The Wendigo, introduced English-speaking readers to a shape-shifting creature from Algonquian traditions, distinct from the Skinwalker, but occupying similar conceptual territory. Blackwood's Wendigo is a spirit of winter starvation that possesses humans and drives them to cannibalism, not a Skinwalker. But the story established a template for how Native American supernatural beliefs could be adapted for horror fiction aimed at white audiences. By the mid-20th century, as Southwestern tourism increased and Anglo-Americans developed a romanticized fascination with Native American culture, references to Navajo witchcraft and shapeshifters began appearing in Western novels and films. These depictions were typically superficial, using the imagery of transformation and dark magic as exotic flavoring for adventure stories. The actual cosmological and ethical frameworks of Navajo belief were ignored in favor of visual spectacle. The moment of transformation, the hunt, the confrontation between white heroes and native monsters. The term Skinwalker itself entered the wider lexicon through several channels. Tony Hillerman's mystery novels, beginning with The Blessing Way in 1970, featured Navajo tribal police officers as protagonists and incorporated authentic details of Navajo culture, including references to skinwalkers. Hillerman, who had lived in New Mexico and worked as a journalist covering Native American issues, treated the subject with more respect than most popular writers of his era. His skinwalkers were genuinely frightening, but also grounded in the belief systems of his Navajo characters. The novels were widely read and helped establish skinwalkers as part of the 1990s saw an acceleration in skinwalker appearances in popular media. The television series, The X-Files, in its 1990 4-episode Shapes, featured a creature identified as a Manitou, an Algonquian term, but with characteristics drawn from various shapeshifter traditions, including skinwalkers. The episode aired to millions of viewers and introduced the concept of Native American shapeshifters to an audience primed by the show. Is blend of horror, mystery, and conspiracy theory. The X-Files treatment of the shapeshifter is instructive in how popular culture transforms indigenous beliefs. The creature in Shapes is portrayed as simultaneously supernatural and biological, something that can be explained through genetics and mutation as much as through spirituality. This reflects the show's overall approach to the paranormal. Everything must be potentially explicable through science, even when it appears magical. The result is a skinwalker emptied of its moral and cultural meaning, reduced to a monster of the weak that exists to be hunted and destroyed by the show's protagonists. The 2000s brought skinwalkers into the horror film genre proper. Skinwalkers, a 2006 film, portrayed skinwalkers as werewolves. Literally, as people infected with a curse that transforms them into wolves during the full moon. The film retained the term skinwalker, but discarded virtually everything else from Navajo tradition, replacing it with European werewolf lore. The skinwalkers in the film are organized into two factions, one that accepts their nature and one that seeks a cure. And the plot revolves around a prophecy and a chosen child, standard horror movie fare, with no connection to the actual cultural origins of skinwalker beliefs. Video games have been perhaps the most aggressive appropriators of skinwalker imagery. Games from World of Warcraft to Fallout, New Vegas to the Elder Scrolls series have featured creatures called skinwalkers, or based on skinwalker lore, almost always as enemies to be killed. These depictions strip away any suggestion of tragedy or moral complexity. The skinwalker becomes pure monster, existing solely as a threat to be overcome. The fact that traditional skinwalker beliefs emphasize the humanity of the witch, the terrible choice that creates a skinwalker, is irrelevant in a medium where the primary interaction is combat. The internet age has brought the most rapid and chaotic evolution of skinwalker lore. Creepypasta stories, Reddit threads, YouTube videos, and TikTok clips have created a new, decentralized mythology around skinwalkers that often bears only superficial resemblance to Navajo beliefs. In these online narratives, skinwalkers are everywhere, not confined to the Southwest, but appearing in forests in New England, suburbs in the Midwest, anywhere people feel a frisson of fear in the dark. Online skinwalker stories follow predictable patterns. Someone camping in the woods hears their friend's voice calling from the darkness, but their friend is right beside them. Someone driving at night sees a figure running alongside their car. Someone's Ring doorbell captures footage of something humanoid moving on all fours. These stories trade on the same primal fears. The uncanny valley of something that looks almost human. The violation of boundaries. The predator at the edge of the firelight. But they have become decontextualized, free-floating horror tropes divorced from their cultural origins. This digital folklore has, perversely, driven renewed interest in authentic Skinwalker lore, leading to tourists visiting the Navajo Nation, hoping to spot skinwalkers, YouTubers making investigation videos on reservation land, and a small industry of skinwalker-themed merchandise. The response from many Navajo people has been frustration, and in some cases, anger. What outsiders treat as entertainment, as a thrill to be sought out, represents something far more serious within Navajo culture. The commercialization of Skinwalker lore is not just cultural appropriation. It is the trivialization of beliefs about real harm, real evil, real social breakdown. The most recent evolution has been the emergence of skinwalkers in the urban legend cinematic universe, alongside other entities like the Rake, Slenderman, and the Smile Dog. In this context, the skinwalker has become a peer to internet, native creations, something that can cross over into other stories, that has a lore that can be expanded and rewritten by anyone with a computer. The Skinwalker has become, in the most literal sense, open source horror. What has been lost in this evolution is the core meaning of the Skinwalker, not as a scary creature, but as a symbol of the person who chooses to harm their own community, who uses their knowledge for selfish ends, who breaks the most fundamental social bonds. Popular culture wants the Skinwalker as monster. It has no use for the Skinwalker as moral lesson, as warning, as the dark mirror of the healer. And so the image persists while the meaning evaporates, leaving us with countless stories about creatures in the night, but no understanding of why those stories mattered in the first place. The Skinwalker, stripped of its cultural context, becomes a reflection not of Navajo values, but of mainstream American anxieties. And perhaps that is the final transformation. Not the witch who puts on the skin of an animal, but the cultural belief that puts on the skin of popular entertainment, moving through the world in a shape that resembles the original, but serves entirely different purposes. If the Skinwalker tradition emerged from a world where survival required absolute trust in your community, where breaking that trust could mean death for everyone, then perhaps the modern resonance of Skinwalker stories points to a society experiencing a different kind of breakdown. Not the harsh physical environment of the high desert, but the harsh social environment of late capitalism, digital isolation, and institutional collapse. The Skinwalker represents the person who pursues power at the expense of community. In traditional Navajo society, this might mean a witch who uses dark magic to harm rivals or accumulate wealth. In contemporary America, it might mean the corporate executive who destroys lives through layoffs to boost stock prices, the politician who betrays their constituents for donor money, the tech billionaire who dissolves social bonds for profit. The specifics change, the pattern remains. What makes someone become a skinwalker? In the traditional telling, it is a choice, a deliberate decision to violate every norm that makes collective life possible. You murder someone you love. You invert sacred knowledge. You put on the skin of a predator and hunt your own people. You can't accidentally become a skinwalker. You can't be forced into it. You choose evil, fully aware of what you are choosing. Modern American life is full of smaller choices that follow the same logic. You can choose personal success at the expense of colleagues. You can choose profit over people. You can choose short-term gain over long-term consequences. You can climb the ladder by stepping on those below you. You can wear the skin of a successful person while hollowing out the community that made your success possible. These choices don't involve literal murder or literal magic, but they follow the same trajectory: the rejection of reciprocity, the embrace of predation, the decision to operate outside the boundaries that make society function. The Skinwalker's power comes from broken taboos. It moves through the world in ways that violate natural law, that break the rules governing human and animal, living and dead. Its very existence is a transgression. And in a society where transgression has become normalized, where norms are routinely violated by those in power, where scandals that would once have ended careers are now barely noticed, where the social contract is dissolving in real time, the Skinwalker becomes more than a monster from someone else's tradition. It becomes a mirror. Consider the Skinwalker's signature ability. Calls out in voices you trust, luring you away from safety. It sounds like your mother, your friend, your child. But the words are wrong. The rhythm. Now consider the experience of navigating modern institutions, corporations, governments, media, that speak in the language of care and community, while acting in pursuit of interests that are fundamentally predatory. We're a family here, says the company that will fire you by email. We serve the public, says the politician, who serves donors, connecting people. Is perfect until you listen closely. This is not unlike the experience of living in an economy where wealth moves at the speed of light, where fortunes are made and destroyed by algorithmic trades faster than human thought, where capital crosses borders instantly while people remain trapped by geography. The rules that govern ordinary life don't apply to those who have transformed into something else, something that operates on a different plane. And the Skinwalker's gaze, the danger of making eye contact, of creating a connection that opens you to harm, resonates in an age of surveillance capitalism, where every interaction is tracked, every click is monetized, every moment of attention becomes a vector for influence and control. To be seen by the Skinwalker is to be marked. To be seen by the algorithmic systems that shape modern life is to have your behavior predicted, your choices constrained, your autonomy eroded. But perhaps the deepest resonance lies in the nature of the Skinwalker as a figure of hidden identity. The witch looks like everyone else. They sit at the table. They know the language. They were raised with the same stories. The threat comes not from outside, but from within, from someone who understands the community well enough to betray it effectively. In a world of grifters and con artists, of influencers and thought leaders, of people who have learned to wear sincerity like a costume while serving interests they never disclose, the Skinwalker stops being supernatural and starts being descriptive. The traditional response to a Skinwalker, according to Navajo law, is not confrontation but avoidance. You don't hunt them. You don't engage. You protect yourself and your family. And you stay away from places where they're known to walk. This is practical wisdom in a context where confronting someone who has crossed every moral boundary is likely to get you killed. But it is also an acknowledgement of a hard truth. Some people cannot be reasoned with, cannot be reformed, cannot be brought back into the circle of community. They have put themselves outside that circle deliberately, and all you can do is recognize what they are and respond accordingly. Applied to contemporary life, this suggests a different approach to certain kinds of evil. Not every wrong can be righted. Not every betrayal can be healed. Some individuals and institutions have gone so far in the direction of predation that the only realistic response is to build walls, to create protected spaces, to find ways of living that minimize exposure to harm. This is not defeatism. It is the recognition that your energy is limited, that not every battle can be won, that sometimes survival means knowing when to avoid the road locals won't look at after dark. The Skinwalker tradition also contains an implicit critique of power itself. The path to becoming a Skinwalker requires accumulating knowledge. The knowledge of ceremonies, of sacred songs, of how the universe operates at levels most people don't access. This is the same knowledge that makes someone a healer, a leader, a teacher. The difference lies in how that knowledge is used. The Skinwalker takes what should serve the community and perverts it to serve the self. Every Skinwalker is a potential healer who chose otherwise. This maps uncomfortably well onto the distribution of knowledge and power in contemporary society. The same education that could produce doctors produces pharmaceutical executives who price insulin out of reach. The same understanding of psychology that could heal trauma is used to design addictive apps. The same grasp of systems that could solve social problems is deployed to extract wealth from those systems. And at the heart of the Skinwalker tradition is the idea that some choices are irreversible, that certain lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. You cannot accidentally murder your sibling. You cannot stumble into performing inverted ceremonies. You cannot wear the skin of a predator by mistake. Every step toward becoming a Skinwalker is conscious, deliberate, informed. And once the transformation is complete, there is no ceremony to undo it, no ritual to bring you back. You are what you chose to become. The finality of that choice, the absence of redemption, troubles modern sensibilities. We want to believe that anyone can change, that no one is beyond saving. But the Skinwalker tradition suggests otherwise. Some transformations are permanent. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. And the person who has decided to hunt their own people has made a choice that reflects something so fundamental about their character that return is not possible. This is a dark vision, and it runs counter to the dominant narratives of contemporary culture, which emphasize growth, change, and redemption. But it may also be more honest about certain kinds of harm. Not every abuser can be rehabilitated. Not every corrupt official can be reformed. Not every predatory system can be fixed from within. Sometimes the only realistic response is to name what has happened, to identify the Skinwalker for what it is, and to build protections that assume no change is coming. The Skinwalker walks at the edge of community, outside the circle of firelight, but close enough to be felt. It knows you. It knows your name, your fears, the voice of everyone you love. It has all the knowledge it needs to destroy, and you have no way to destroy it, no ritual to bind it, no weapon that strikes at what it has become. All you have is the knowledge of what it is, and the wisdom to stay away from the places where it hunts. That knowledge, sparse as it is, may be enough, because the Skinwalker's power lies partly in the fear it generates, the paranoia, the sense that anyone might be a witch in disguise. If you spend all your energy looking for Skinwalkers, you'll tear your community apart from within, which is exactly what the Skinwalker wants. But if you know the signs, if you understand the patterns, if you've learned which roads to avoid, you can live your life without being consumed by fear. The Skinwalker walks. It has always walked. It will continue to walk. And the fact that most people will never see it, never know its name, never understand what it is, that is not ignorance. That is, the people who know the most about Skinwalkers are the people who have no choice but to know. The people whose ancestors learned through hard experience what it means to live in a world where some members of the community choose predation over reciprocity. If you are hearing these stories for the first time, understand that you are not being given permission to go looking. You are being given a warning. There are places where the old knowledge still matters. where the boundaries between human and animal, sacred and profane, community and chaos are thinner than you think. There are people who still know how to walk those boundaries, and not all of them walk with good intentions. The road stretches north through reservation land, unnamed on most maps. The flashlight beam trembles in the dark. The wind carries no sound you recognize. And somewhere, moving between the shadows and the stunted trees. And it knows, with absolute certainty, that you will not speak of this encounter to anyone who matters. Because the people who would believe you already know to stay away, and the people who would laugh at you are not worth warning. The Skinwalker remains, not as folklore, not as entertainment, but as knowledge held close by those who understand its weight. And the silence that surrounds that knowledge, the refusal to explain, to detail, to satisfy curiosity, is not obscurantism or gate